Let me welcome Teresa and particularly Rebecca Grynspan, the Secretary General of UNCTAD, who has sent us a video speech. But let me welcome her virtually as well as Teresa, who's here. Let me also welcome Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, the Principal Coordinator or Sherpa of Civil 20, Fernando Blanco, of the former National Director for Consumer Defense in Argentina, Teresa, as I have already suggested, Shirish Deshpande. Shirish, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Hello, welcome, hi. Shirish. Motta from IBASE, yes. Is he there?
Oh, he should be here. I thought not yet.
Not yet. Well, let's wait for him. Thezi Mabuza from South Africa. Are you there?
Yes, I think there is one. Yeah, okay.
This is Nom Pumelelo or something. This one connecting to audio. Inda? Yes. Inda, are you there? South Africa, Thezi, welcome.
Yes.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Teza, Inda? Inda, are you there? And I hope she joins. Saroja?
She's muted. She's muted.
Oh, Inda is there.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Inda.
Pradeep, how
welcome.
are you?
So nice to see you.
Yeah, me too. Nice to see you, my teacher.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for your kind sentiments. Igor, Dr. Nava Subramanian?
Yeah, I think Nava is also there. She's
yes,
there she
I'm
is.
here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Anyway, welcome. With that, we've all in place.
Hello, Pradeep. This is Saroja.
Hi, Saroja. I welcomed you.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you not hear that? Anyway, let me welcome you once again. Read out my welcome note the best that I can in order to not make it boring. I usually don't read out speeches, but given the solemn occasion, I thought it would be important. Before we hear Rebeca, the G20 group of 19 countries and the European Union was established in 1999 as a platform for finance ministers and central bank governors to discuss international economic and financial issues post the financial crisis. The issues go beyond just financial and economic matters and includes topics like the plight and well-being of consumers. In the wake of the global financial and economic crisis of 2007 and 8 that exposed significant weaknesses in the global financial system, the G20 was elevated to the level of heads of state and government and was named the premier forum for international economic cooperation. This is a kind of a subset of the United Nations in a sense, and probably the most effective multilateral body that we have in terms of at least discussions and serious discussions, I would say. The first G20 Leaders Summit took place in November 2007 in Washington, D.C., where heads of state and governments discussed strategies to address the crisis collectively. Subsequent summits continue to focus on measures to restore global economic growth, strengthen financial regulations, and enhance international cooperation in managing financial risks. The G20 focused largely on broad macroeconomic issues, but it has since expanded its agenda to inter alia include trade. And as I talk, there is a trade officials meeting going on in Jaipur, my hometown. Sustainable development, health, agriculture, energy, environment, climate change, and anti-corruption. Today, together, the G20 countries account for almost 75% of the global trade and 85% of the global GDP. Nevertheless, with the onset of the global financial crisis in 2008, consumer protection became an important issue for the G20. It began to recognize the importance of protecting consumers from fraudulent and unfair business practices to promote sustainable economic growth and development. Subsequent G20 summits therefore began to address consumer protection policies and took a number of initiatives to advance the consumer protection agenda. We were very happy to see that progress. In 2011, the G20 summit hosted by the French government in Cannes highlighted the importance of keeping consumers at the heart of G20's work. Somehow it's slipping. However, the strong impetus emerged during the German G20 presidency in 2017, when Berlin hosted the inaugural G20 Consumer Summit, focusing on fostering consumer trust in the digital age. And some of us here have been a part of that summit as well. And we'll hear about that. Following that year's G20 summit, the digital ministers of the G20 released a statement on April 7th acknowledging the suggestions put forth at the G20 Consumer Summit and highlighted the significance of establishing a trustworthy digital environment for consumers. This success of the first summit quickly paved the way for the second G20 Consumer Summit in Buenos Aires in 2018, held under the Argentinian presidency of the G20, with the National Directorate for Consumer Protection as the host. And we have a representative here from the Argentinian government as well. Discussions at the summit covered various issues, including child safety in internet-connected products, emerging challenges in product safety, and concerns about food waste. Furthermore, in 2019, a G20 International Conference in Consumer Policy took place as a side event during the G20 Osaka Summit. During this conference, the G20 countries and affiliated organizations engaged in deliberations on addressing novel consumer issues arising from the rapid advancement of digitalization and progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and shared policy challenges among governments. Over the years, G20 summits have worked on a number of initiatives related to consumer protection, including developing principles for effective consumer dispute resolution, harnessing technology to improve consumer safety, product safety, and sharing information on consumer protection issues related to e-commerce, scams, fake reviews, and the digital economy, etc. Thus, consumer protection has indeed been a topic of discussion within the G20 framework. However, the prominence of consumer protection as a specific agenda item varied from one G20 summit to another, depending on the global economic and political context at that time. In fact, during the last two summits, the consumer protection topic got diluted considerably. Our collective endeavor, therefore, should be to ensure that this omission is rectified within the G20 agenda during the upcoming summit in Brazil, South Africa, and the subsequent gatherings. We don't stop at South Africa. The phrase, consumers are the raison d'etre of all economic activity, underscores the central importance of consumer demand in shaping markets, industries, and economies as a whole. At the core of this concept is the understanding that economic activities from production to innovation revolve around fulfilling and satisfying consumer needs and desires. The phrase serves as a reminder that sustainable economic growth and prosperity hinge on catering to and aligning with the dynamic expectations of consumers whose choices shape industries, stimulate trade, and determine the overall success of economic systems. A key milestone in consumer protection was the adoption of the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection in 1985, to which all G20 members are committed. While the UNGCP is not directly tied to the formation of the G20 or its commitments, it does influence global discussions and policies related to consumer protection. G20 members should therefore recognize the importance of consumer rights and fair business practices within their economies. India indeed has a rich history in advocating for consumer protection and valuing the well-being of consumers. Mahatma Gandhi, father of our nation, his philosophy and principles have significantly influenced India's approach to consumer rights and ethics. Gandhi's talisman underscores the importance of consumers when he said, "A customer is the most important visitor on our premises. He's not dependent on us. We are dependent on him or her. He or she is not an interruption in our work, but he or she is the purpose of the work. He or she is not an interruption in our work, he is the purpose. Not she is not an outsider in our business, but he or she is a part of it. We are not doing him or her a favor by serving them. They are doing us a favor by giving us an opportunity to do so. This is what Gandhi had said many years ago. This highlights the central role of customers and their well-being in all endeavors. In the context of consumer protection movements, India has taken proactive steps to safeguard consumer interests. The landmark Consumer Protection Act of 1986 and aimed to ensure fair trade and shield consumers from deceptive practices. In recent years, India further strengthens its commitment by enacting the Consumer Protection, a new act of 2019, which was designed to cope with modern challenges like e-commerce and digital rights, which is, creating a lot of sort of problems all over the world. This legislation empowers consumers, imposes stricter penalties for unfair practices, and enhances dispute resolution. Prioritizing consumers demonstrates India's dedication to fostering an ethical and transparent marketplace benefiting both consumers. This year's G20 theme, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, it's a Sanskrit phrase, which means the world is one family, mirrors the sentiment urging global unity. Just as this philosophy encourages unity, it underscores the universal nature of consumer needs and rights. Embracing this concept encourages ethical practices, fair treatment, and global consumer consciousness for equitable access to goods and information. By the way, the one thing which this current G20 summit has come out with, which relates to sustainable consumption, one of the issues which has been covered by not only the UN guidelines, but as well as the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, is what is called life. How do you use your space in a way that is least burdensome on the environment, and that is a strong movement which is going on. So it is not as if consumer issues are absent, but they're not defined in the way what has been happening. Now, given this kind of scenario, the substantial engagement that India has in enhancing consumer protection and fostering a fair marketplace, India is well positioned to take a leading role in these global efforts. With that, let me conclude my opening remarks and welcome you all once again and request the organizers to please play the tape of Rebeca Grynspan, the Honorable Secretary General of UNCTAD.
Your Excellency, Pradeep Mehta, Secretary General of CATS International, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear friends. Last June, I had the pleasure of being in Varanasi, India, during the G20 Development Ministers meeting. There, I said these words that I would like to repeat today. The 2030 Agenda and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals are not just a set of targets. It is ourselves and to future generations. It is the last collective roadmap in a world that is more polarized than ever, a world in desperate need of solidarity and multilateralism. End of quote. This, dear friends, is the underlying truth of the world we live in. And yet, in a context of cascading crisis, by nearly every measure, we are moving backwards. Backwards on ending poverty, backwards on hunger, backwards on women's rights, and backwards on development, with only 12% of the Sustainable Development Goals on track. But let me emphasize one thing. It is not just statistics and percentages that lie at the heart of the crisis. It is people from all over the world. People as workers, as parents, as entrepreneurs, as students, citizens all over the world, and people, finally, as consumers. It is against this stark background that we meet today at this CATS Global webinar. And this background should remind us that consumer protection is not just a policy or a regulation. It is the armor that shields us all from harm, deception, and fraud. It is the foundation upon which trust is built, and it is trust that ultimately fuels the engines of progress and multilateralism. Indeed, this is an insight that is ingrained in the very name of CATS, Consumer Unity and Trust Society. Only in a society where consumers are protected can trust be built. For instance, when a parent buys medicine for their sick child, they trust that it will heal and not harm. When students invest in an online course, they trust it will pave the way for a brighter future. When we purchase products labeled as sustainable, we trust that we are contributing to the well-being of our planet. All these threads are woven into the tapestry of consumer protection. And yet, the obvious fact is that as our economy develops through uncharted technological waters, it is getting harder and harder to protect our consumers. Unscrupulous elements, for example, are finding new ways to exploit the vulnerable in the digital arena. We are witnessed a surge in online scams, counterfeit products, and predatory lending, all aimed at the consumer who are struggling to make ends meet in the cost of living crisis. The platformization of the digital economy is also creating challenges for consumers' privacy, quality assurance. We must ensure that information made available to consumers is adequate, clear, and timely. Ensure that consumer reviews are truthful and that social media influencers respect advertising and endorsement of the rules. Similarly, to press pause on climate degradation and meet the Paris targets, we need a profound revolution in how we produce and consume. According to the IPCC, 70% of all greenhouse gas reductions must come from demand-side policies. But consumers will only play this transformative role if they have the right education and awareness-raising campaigns, if adequate labeling and information are provided to them, if rights are protected and upheld. Dear friends, today's webinar is about the G20 and how it can champion consumers worldwide and address the challenges I just mentioned. UNCTAD, as focal point on consumer protection within the United Nations system, 20 presidencies in advancing consumer protection at the global level. Since the first Consumer Summit in Berlin in 2017, followed by Buenos Aires, Tokushima, and Trieste. The discussions and agreements reached at UNCTAD's Intergovernmental Group of Experts on Consumer Protection Law and Policy have been instrumental in shaping the G20 consumer exchanges, as UNCTAD hosts the only global annual forum on this issue at the UN. For example, UNCTAD held the first global discussion on the contribution of consumer protection to sustainable consumption in July 2019. This issue was later addressed as one of the main sessions at the G20 Consumer Summit in Tokushima, just 2 months later. In general, the G20 Consumer Summits have been an effective way to mainstream consumer protection issues in the wider G20 discussions on such wide challenges as the digital transformation and the green transitions. Following a successful consumer summit, the declaration of G20 digital ministers of 2021 under Italian presidency contains a full chapter on consumers' awareness and protection in the global digital economy. This was a great achievement. It is important, however, that we continue calling for G20 summits. This year, India convened an important meeting for G20 global food regulators, an area which is extremely important for consumer protection worldwide. But we must remain extremely ambitious and call for another G20 Consumer Summit as soon as possible. I hope all of us today can join our voices into making that a reality. And I wish all of us a very successful meeting. I thank you.
I'd like to thank Rebeca in absence. Teresa, would you please convey her our applause for an excellent speech? And let me reiterate what I had said earlier is that in as much as consumer defense is important, we have to remind the world that the whole economy runs on the basis of consumers. We are the raison d'etre. And as Rebeca has inspired us, we hope that in Brazil we can have a consumer summit of the G20 again and sort of recapture the lost thread. And I see Mr. Motta has also joined us. Mr. Motta, welcome. Mr. Motta, welcome. I'm glad that you are there.
Good morning.
And there's a challenge for you and for Igor.
Welcome, Athayde.
Sorry?
No, sorry, I'm just saying welcome to Mr. Motta.
With that, let me hand over to my dear friend and comrade Shirish. Shirish, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Pradeep, for giving me this opportunity. And at the outset, let me congratulate Pradeep and Cuts for having organized this sort of a get-together and linking consumers to G20 in India. That was something, a missing link, which Pradeep has very laudably done it, and compliments to you, Pradeep, for that. Let me introduce myself. I am Shirish Deshpande. I am chairman of Mumbai Grahak Panchayat, a voluntary consumer organization active in the field of consumer education, consumer protection, overall consumer movement, I would say, for last 48 years. And in fact, luckily, I happened to attend the first consumer summit, consumer protection summit under the G20 that was held in Germany in 2017. So it's a sort of a coincidence that today also I happen to be on this, although we are not under the umbrella of consumer protection summit under G20, but be it so, we are still deliberating on the same issues. In fact, if we see from 2017, 2018 also there was a consumer protection summit in Argentina, 2019 in Japan, and 2021 in Italy, where consumer protection summit was a part and parcel of the G20. Unfortunately, in G20 in India, somehow we missed that thing in spite of our efforts to that effect. Be it so, now today we are here to connect this consumer and the consumer movement to G20. And for that, once again, compliments to Pradeep. Now, the first session that is there, it is on the evolution of the consumer protection on the G20 agenda from past to present. And for that, we have two speakers today. One is Mr. Vijay Nambiar, and the other is Mr. Fernando Blanco. Now, both of us will have some limited time. I'm going to ask 2 questions to each of them. Time is a essence. 8 minutes each will be given to them. And I will ask 2 questions relevant to them. And of course, if time permits, we will also take a couple of questions. And these questions, the participants may perhaps put it in the chat box, and we'll see if we can take on that also, and the speakers will address that and answer these questions. The first speaker now, if we see, we are fortunate enough to have today Mr. Vijay K. Nambiar, who's on this as a principal coordinator, Sherpa as we call it, for Civil 20. It's again, I think, a byproduct of G20, C20. You will elaborate hopefully on that. Mr. Nambiar was a Chancellor's Gold Medal for his Masters in 1965. He joined India's Foreign Service in 1967, and after which he was posted to various places, Hong Kong, Beijing, then in Yugoslavia. He was also with United Nations. Ambassadorial posting was to Algiers, followed by Afghanistan, Malaysia, China, and Pakistan. So practically all strategically important countries, I think he had the privilege of being there. So he's also the permanent representative at India's UN mission in New York. In 2004, he retired and served as a Deputy National Security Advisor. He was later Chef de Cabinet to UN SG Ban Ki-moon and his advisor on Myanmar. Currently, he is the principal coordinator Sherpa Civil 20 in G20 India. Now, with this, my first question to Mr. Nambiar. As a principal coordinator for Civil 20, could you please elaborate on the challenges in promoting the consumer protection at G20 level? Over to you, Mr. Nambiar.
Thank you.
And the time limit for each question. The first question also 8 minutes. After that, I will come to you with a second question, for which also Pradeep has told me strictly 8 minutes. So
Thank you, Mr. Deshpande. I'll try and do it as fast as. First of all, let me say that we are at a very critical moment in history today. We are just, the Chandrayaan is just about going to land, and it looks like it has actually reached. It's a very interesting point we are reaching, and while we are having this meeting. But let me first of all thank Mr. Pradeep Mehta of the CUTS International for inviting me to speak at this webinar. Over the 4 decades of its existence, CUTS has built a global footprint for itself, and it has been the primary platform for consumers, trade, and market competition. And if CUTS has made itself into such a formidable institution, the credit for it must go to Pradeep Gupta for he who has emerged as an authentic developing country voice. He is, as rightly described, as a living treasure. As an engagement group, I'll first talk about the C20, and as an engagement group of the G20, representing civil society, C20 sees itself as located between the state and the market, consisting of institutions that don't obstruct the state from fulfilling its role as arbiter between the major interests of society, but it tries to prevent it from atomizing society and transcends the state. We try to bring public accountability and participatory government by making states more responsive, societies more participative, and development policies more inclusive to build a larger consensus on social goals. Now, the subject today is championing the consumer movement. Consumer movement, Pradeep just said that consumers are the raison d'etre of economic activity. Let me slightly disagree with him and say that they are not the only raison d'etre. While societies organize and articulate systems of production and distribution of goods and services, we must recognize that the main goals of activity must be production, maintenance, and improvement of a sustainable quality of life on this planet. If this is true, then our focus should be on enhancing the capability of the system to produce and make accessible goods and services for all. And a free and vibrant market normally is based on interactions between producers, traders, and consumers to develop these economic activities effectively. But it is obviously clear around the world that there are asymmetries, inequalities, vulnerabilities that impact the market system and underline the need for consumer protection. A simple mechanism of demand and supply between consumers and suppliers is not enough, clearly. If that were true, there wouldn't have been 800 million famished people, undernourished people in the world today, and the global food bill of almost 2 trillion, which the FAO has calculated. Now, obviously, from this perspective, the principles of fair trade, consumer-friendly practices, equitable economic development lies at the heart of our shared vision as C20 of a prosperous and sustainable global society. And therefore, it is incumbent on us, both as C20 and G20, to prioritize consumer protection within the G20 agenda. Now, obviously, every decision on economic growth or development has consequences. At the domestic level, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a privileged few can have far-reaching consequences on social cohesion and economic well-being. It is imperative that we consider implementing progressive goals to ensure principles of equity and distributive justice. And that, I think, the G20 is both uniquely positioned and should have the political will to do. Now, we are aware of the priority attention for consumer protection of the French and the German summits, the fact that the 2 global summits, consumer summits, were held in the German and Argentinian presidency, and the wide issues that were covered there. Apart from the side event in Osaka, the Saudi summit declaration of 2020 set a strong foundation by fostering an open, fair, non-discriminatory environment for protecting and empowering consumers. The subsequent summit in Rome and Bali refined this focus, acknowledging the significance of the digital economy. In the wake of the pandemic, we found ourselves at a critical juncture, obviously. The digital transformation has accelerated while presenting new risks and opportunities. We wanted to, on the one hand, harness the powers of digitalization to empower consumers with information, but we also had to safeguard their privacy and protect them from undue traceability and things like that. The C20 Italian document, while speaking of an enabling international environment, also called for reform of trade arrangements to ensure resilience, sustainability, and reduce dependence on external shocks. From the perspective of the Indian C20 summit, which was held in July in Jaipur, some of the cross-cutting issues it addresses includes support for the development of robust estimation tools to accurately account for negative externalities caused by domestic and international private businesses, including air and water pollution, as well as others affecting public health, such as sugar-based industries causing obesity, tobacco-based industries causing cancer, fossil fuel-powered automobiles causing air pollution, etc. It called for taxing businesses and industries for profits which they had from these activities which caused externalities. And we wanted to prevent profiteering at the expense of people and the planet. And it is in that sense that in terms of food choices, for example, they all called on the G20 to take bold steps towards implementing environment labeling, taxing of environmentally damaging food products, calling for a new perspective to look at the fashioning of new lifestyles for environment, what Pradeep talked about, the LI, or Life for Environment, which seeks to incentivize pricing of less impacting food products to motivate consumers to make healthier choices on food, and which are beneficial for the environment, and to have what they call sustainable lifestyle in a circular economy with a view to ultimately working towards what they call Sumangalam, or global well-being. The C20 Committee on Financial Issues in the policy recommendations made specific reference to the UN General Assembly of April 18th this year, which talked about the social and solidarity economy for achieving the SDGs. In a broader sense, the social and solidarity economy is the creation of collective rather than individual wealth, care for nature and biodiversity, and the best interests of humanity, and which reconciles environmental respect, social utility, and economic activities. The UN resolution encourages member states to promote and implement strategies which support and enhance the SSEs, developing specific legal frameworks and innovative financial instruments. According to the Global Partnership for Finance Inclusion Working Group of the G20 India Finance Track, recently they had a meeting, They said the need to guarantee an adequate level of digital financial literacy and an effective regulation aimed at protecting final consumers, as well as interoperability among systems, especially for cross-border perspectives, appears to the key to the success of the digital public infrastructure. But DPI, which is digital public infrastructure, has brought new challenges to consumer protection. Online transactions across borders can be more difficult to regulate, and consumers may face issues with cross-border disputes, fraudulent websites, data privacy concerns, etc. So as technology evolves, new products and services may not fit easily within the consumer protection frameworks. And that is where, when we talk about the principle of leaving no one behind for both and the national and international framework, this should be at the core of our policy planning for the implementation of financial literacy. Regulatory agencies must enforce consumer protection laws, and they may face resource constraints, but they must make it difficult for them to investigate potential violations effectively. Accessible and efficient dispute resolution mechanisms are essential for enforcing consumer rights. Delays, high cost of legal procedures also discourage these. All these have to be viewed very, very strongly by the G20, and I think this is the area. I have, of course, many other points to make of future G20 meetings, but I don't know if my 8 minutes are off, and therefore I will stop at this stage. Okay.
I will give you the opportunity for the next question, wherein you can cover the same thing.
Okay, after the next speaker. Okay.
What my second question is exactly on that. Can you elaborate on any strategies or the approaches that have been employed to ensure the consumer protection remains the significant presence within the C20 agenda? And a supplement to that, my last question, and that is something which I'm connecting with what Ms. Rebeca also observed. Perhaps is it possible for G20 and perhaps you as a Sherpa for C20, is it still possible for India to organize consumer protection summit within the framework of G20 or C20? Over to you, Mr. Nambiar.
Well, a quick answer to that is I'm not sure whether there is still, it is now possible to organize this thing under the Indian presidency, but it's a continuing process. So I don't think much is lost. I think this is a continuing process. Let me say, any approach to consumer protection must take into consideration basic ground realities. There's a lot of basic lack of awareness among consumers that lead to exploitation by unscrupulous businesses. Consumers don't know how to assert their rights or take legal action. Law enforcement is a common but crucial challenge, and laws may exist, but they very often lack enforcement mechanisms. Consumer protection laws are complex, and consumers don't understand how to do it. Then there's the question of balance between protecting consumers and fostering business innovation. Between over-regulation and under-regulation, I don't know how we are going to leave the consumers very often are left vulnerable. And dealing with the complexities of global supply chains, every entity along the supply chain must ensure that there is adequate consumer protection laws. And that is a very difficult thing to go right down the line. So addressing these challenges require a multifaceted approach involving education, strong enforcement, collaboration between government and private sector, regulation, and regular updates, and adopting technological advances. Now, past articulations have been there, World Economic Forum, Busan Partnership Agreements, all they talked about various things. In fact, they talked about even civil society as being capacity builders, incubators, representatives, citizenship champions, and all that. But as far as I can see, if looking into the future, I am mindful that the Indian summit will be followed by Brazil and South Africa. The C20 must actually seek a wider and stronger role with a comprehensive view of the global supply chain and look beyond simple demands exerted by consumers. What do they involve in practice? You know, my Italian colleague in the C20, Riccardo Moro, used to say that where goods and services are sold in the market, we must be able to provide the community with precise information of the story of these products, the origin, respect for human and labor rights, environmental impacts of the production, packaging, transport, things like that. Antitrust laws must be approved by all G20 members in a coordinated form to prevent monopolies and market dominance. What is most important is that the terms and limits of the actions in the in the net are legally regulated to avoid the concentration of power in the hands of few economic giants that are today de facto determining the shape of e-commerce. I think this is one of the biggest problems, that it is not just risks of e-commerce emanating from issues of safety, security, or respect of contracts, privacy, data protection. It's the risk of concentration of power. I think that's the biggest risk. The recent evolution of e-commerce in that respect is very, very worrying, I think. Some of the biggest platforms are not only virtual supermarkets anymore. The big actors are transforming their digital platforms into virtual market squares, which are being offered to producers. You know, in the old days, it is the municipality used to provide the public space for people to actually sell their goods and services. Today, that authority is has actually been almost grabbed by these platforms, and the public authority, which used to ensure the functionings of the market and ensure that access to all are in accordance with the law, they respect the law. Now there is no such rule. People are actually, the net is the rule, the private actors provide the digital space, and they have the power to select who can access it. Now that is a huge problem, and I think that has not only implications for the consumers, but it has deeper implications for our own democratic practices and growing. I think this is the biggest problem we need to look at. I think I'll stop here now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nambiar. I think we had a good journey from the beginning till present thing. And you have also touched upon what future will be there. And you are optimistic that perhaps in the Brazil and next another country, I think it's going to be Argentina.
South Africa, yes. South Africa,
yeah. Where perhaps the Consumer Protection Summit will find its place. And that is a very, very optimistic note. But notwithstanding that, I think we still feel that the consumer protection agenda must find a place even within the G20 philosophy as such, because although it is a financial and macroeconomic activity as such, as it originally stood, but over a period of time, the G20 has given due weightage and consideration to the consumer protection, and rightly so. So I'm sure in future, definitely the consumer protection will have its own place of honor, dignity, and a rightful place where the consumer issues, and there are more challenging issues now with the new technology and all, as we know. So, I mean, they are becoming more and more complicated and complex. So they deserve the attention, address, and the resolution at every possible stage of a policy making. So with that, thank you very much. We will go to our next speaker. Next speaker is Mr. Fernando Blanco. He is the former president of Argentine Consumers Union from 2010 till 2015. After that, he was appointed as a National Director of Consumer Defense from 2015 till 2019. Currently, he is the Director General of Justice Commission of the Legislature of City of Buenos Aires and Executive Director of the Center for Studies in Consumer Laws. I welcome you, Mr. Blanco, and the questions to you, again, the same. There are two questions going to be there with 8 minutes time limit, which Mr. Nambiar very nicely and strictly adhered to. So I hope you will also adhere to the same time limit for us. And the first question to you for 8 minutes is, could you share some insights into how consumer protection initiatives have evolved within G20 framework, highlighting any significant shifts in the focus or strategies from the early discussions to the present day? As you know that it all started, G20 things started from 1999. Today we are in 2023. The point that I would like to also take opportunity to highlight is when we are talking about the consumer protection issues, UNCTAD has played a very significant role in this. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think Teresa is there, she can correct me if I'm wrong, that in organizing this consumer protection summits from Germany onward from 2017, UNCTAD has played a very significant and crucial role. And I'm happy that today, Rebeca, our Secretary General, also addressed this gathering. Teresa is also there present to share her views also and moderate one session and give her comments on that. So with this, I hand over to Blanco. We would like to hear something from you on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirish. Thank you. I'm really happy to share this initiative with you and all the people that is looking for this possibility. I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar together with authorities and specialists who have been working for a long time, like you, either from governments and from civil society. It's very relevant that these types of initiatives are carried out. As you know, G20 is a political construction. The G20 shows a process of sustained growth since its initiation. In effect, the financial crisis of the first years of the century were the explained for finance minister and presidents of central banks to define a common roadmap in the face of the consequences of those crises that generated uncertainty, instability, and volatility. We know that in this critical context, it's not only relevant to emphasize public financial policy, but also on the social effects. That is why the first G20 agendas have been closely linked to financial issues, not protection, consumer protection. Once global calm was restored, began to give way to other issues, and the G20 agendas grow year by year. With regard to consumer protection, in my opinion, the great milestone has been the inclusion, as was said here, the issue under the presidency of Germany in 2017. For the first time, the German government proposed holding a summit with its own agenda in terms of defense of consumer, which was held in Berlin and was co-organized by Consumers International. This is a very important issue to remember the work for Consumers International, and the technical support of the OECD and the UNCTAD teams. I want to recognize and especially thank the work of German government, CI, OECD, and UNCTAD, because the summit aroused the interest and active and face-to-face participation of authorities from all the G20 member countries, making it a great precedent for the presidents that came after. Now, as you know, in diplomatic matters, it's not only important to include an issue on the agenda, in the Sherman case through a summit, but that effort must be completed. Sometimes it's achieved and other times not, with the mention, the reference to the subject in the final declaration and statement of the meeting of presidents. At this point, the role of local authorities and their negotiation capacity to be able to capture the conclusions on the matter in that final declaration becomes very relevant. It's not a summit, it's a summit plus the statement. For this reason, the work on the Germany presidency was very valuable because it managed to incorporate the reference to the protection of consumers in digital environments in the statement. I know that as there is a very significant number of issues that have an impact on consumer protection. The G20 has focused on digital economy, and in this way, it has been incorporated under the following presidencies. All the references in the final statements were about digital economy in relation with consumer protection. And a special mention to the strategy of continuity of the subject in the agenda of the G20 is not just about organizing a summit and getting it included in the final declaration. It corresponds to the diplomatic management of the country that exercised the presidency of the group to ensure that it has a continuity under the following presidencies. For this, systematic and coordinated work must be carried out to convince the next presidency of the need to keep the issue on the agenda. I must admit that this work was carried out cleverly by the German authorities, who from their summit in Berlin will coordinate teams with Argentine authorities. In my country, during 2018, we were also able to organize the summit, and with a lot of diplomatic work involved, we ratified the inclusion of the topic in the final declaration. During the summit, a discussion panel on product safety was integrated that, for the first time, brought together the global platforms that work on the subject. Our work, just as we had seen it from Germany, continued with the joint agenda with the Japanese government to hold the presidency during 2019, organizing a conference in the city of Tokushima, Japan. In my opinion, the COVID-19 pandemic has implied opening a new scenario where the priorities of the states were health, provision of vaccines, and aid to the countries most in need. And that is what the presidents of Saudi Arabia, Italy, and Indonesia focus on. It's therefore appropriate to resume the consumer protection agenda with clear and comprehensive objectives, not only in digital economy, but also other issues that I will develop in the next answer, I suppose, and by the G20 countries individually and as a group. Thank you, Shirish.
Thank you. My next question, Blanco, is drawing from your experience now, the past experience that you have, what are some specific challenges that countries like Argentina have faced in promoting the consumer protection on G20 agenda? And how were these challenges addressed or overcome? Can you say something on that?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Shirish. Well, in my opinion, the impact of economic globalization must be recognized, and in the midst of it, how there are winning and losing societies. According Adam Smith said, the big challenge is not to widen the gap within unequal societies and promote active public policies that encourage consumption to improve the quality of life. Specifically, taking into account the experience of Argentina and the rest of the Latin American countries, I believe it's important to unify product quality standards for all countries, so that there are no unequal levels in the matter that put the lives of consumers at risk. Likewise, it's necessary for the states to advance in frameworks for the flow of information and data that don't only expose the privacy of consumers, but also end up integrating devices where artificial intelligence is based. The velocity pace of technological development is causing states to fall far behind in regulatory matters, and this is maybe implying increasing levels of lack of protection. A novel topic, typical of economy, a digital economy, and the growth of e-commerce is that consumers review on platforms. The new global trade gives great value to these consumer opinions, and they constitute a source of information for those who surf the networks. We see that in some cases, this very useful tool is being distorted by false opinions from false profiles, true quality of the service offered. Consequently, I believe that it's necessary to think about common regulatory frameworks, and in this sense, I believe that the proposal for a model law on reviews would be very valuable to be discussed within the framework of G20 to contribute to the intergovernmental group of experts that works under the power enforcement from UNCTAD. In the same way, in my opinion, it's necessary to incorporate into the consumer protection agenda a central issue such as food loss and waste. It's not only necessary to produce food for the world population, but to stop losing in it and wasting it through inefficient production and commercial system. It's a really things that all countries can explain. In relation to our American continent, so far from India, Shirish, where consumer law has been growing in the last 40 years, it's necessary to promote a policy that activated the participation of civil society through serious, solvent, and suitable consumer associations that are recognized by states and with legitimacy to exercise the representation of consumers. There are countries in America, our continent, that don't register the presence of these kind of entities, and others that, despite having them recognized in their regulations, don't follow their work on or intend to use them politically according to the administration on duty. In other words, it's very important to promote a strong and sustainable consumer movement over time. Finally, in my opinion, given the growth of consumer law and taking into account the jurisprudential precedents that are being generated and that arise from cards that don't necessarily dominate the matter, I consider that it's necessary to promote the integration of a consumer defense jurisdiction. Along these lines, the city of Buenos Aires, capital of Argentina Republic, has put into operation the first consumer law judges in the country, with 3 courts with exclusive jurisdiction over consumer law. To this end, the selection process for new judges has been promoted through a public contest, and additionally, a code for jurisdiction has approved that established principles of the management based on immediacy, agility, and informality to give consumers prompt responses to their claims for non-compliance with providers. I believe that this model of autonomy of the matter should be replicated in all the states. Well, those are some ideas that I share with you and with all of the friends that we are in this webinar, and hoping that the next presidencies, Brazil, near from here, and South Africa can organize a summit again, because it's very important in our agenda that the G20 assume this challenge. Thank you, Cyrus.
Thank you. I must thank both the speakers, Blanco Fernando and Mr. Vijay Nambiar, for taking us through the evolution of the consumer protection on the G20 agenda right from 1999 till date, and also some optimism that has been shared and expressed on this platform by both the eminent speakers. And we do hope that the consumer protection will figure prominently, if not dominantly, and they will get its deserved place on the G20 agenda in future, maybe looking forward to now Brazil in 2024. And with this, I thank both the speakers, and I declare that the first session is over, and now a more interesting and a more fascinating session you're going to have it, and for which I will hand it over to Teresa Moreira from UNCTAD, where she's going to deal with a session on emerging issues in global consumer protection. Everybody is, I think, anxious, including me, to hear more from Teresa as well as from the speakers in that session. Thank you again to all, and over to you, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Shirish. I hope you are all able to hear and see me well. Allow me to start wishing our speakers and participants good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And also from the part of UNCTAD, after, of course, the video address of our Secretary General, Ms. Rebeca Grynspan, to welcome you to the CUT's global webinar on the G20 championing the consumer movement, organized with the support of UNCTAD. I am Teresa Moreira, the head of the Competition and Consumer Policies branch of UNCTAD. And in this session, we will be discussing, as mentioned already, some emerging issues in global consumer protection with representatives of government and civil society from Brazil and South Africa, which happen to be the two future presidencies of the G20. We will aim to identify the coming issues in consumers' lives across the world and highlight pathways for consultation, collaboration, and cooperation. From the point of view of the usual housekeeping rules, I would like again to inform all participants that I will be taking a few questions from the audience towards the end of this session, if time allows. Please post your questions by using the Q&A box or the chat box provided by Zoom. So now I would like to turn to my eminent speakers, and I would like to introduce them. Starting with Mr. Athayde Motta. He is presently the Executive Director at the Brazilian Institute for Social and Economic Analyses, IBASE. IBASE, the acronym read in Portuguese, and he previously worked with the sectors of extractive industries, youth collectives, community development in slum and poor areas, human rights indicators, international trade agreements, and international cooperation. Then we have Ms. Thezi Mabuza, who is currently Deputy Commissioner at the National Consumer Commission of South Africa, having leaving the employment of the Trade and Department Industry as the Chief Director of National Liquor Authority. Previously, Ms. Mabuza was the Senior Manager for Skills Development and Administration at the Safety and Security Sector Education and Training Authority, SAST, and she also held directorship positions at the Department of Correctional Services, being responsible for the functional and management training and training standards. So on this note, I would like to start with my questions, and as Shirish did, I think my speakers are already online. Yes, Mr. Motta, bom dia. And Ms. Mabuza, Thezi, as usual, a great pleasure to have you. I would ask each of the speakers 2 questions, as in the previous session, kindly requesting them to keep their answers, let's say, to 7 minutes each, if possible. So, as I mentioned, we are aiming to identify coming issues in consumer lives across the world, and also identify or highlight pathways for consultation, collaboration, and cooperation, which, as you can imagine, are especially important and meaningful from the point of view of UNCTAD, due to the fact that we provide the largest platform in all areas under our mandate, which of course include, in this case, consumer protection, since we have 195 members. And we do focus on assisting developing countries. So starting with Mr. Motta, the first question would be on your views regarding G20 and consumer and sustainability. So given the interconnectedness of sustainable development and consumer protection, could you please elaborate on how integrating consumer protection measures into the G20 agenda can contribute to achieving global sustainability goals, especially within the G20 countries? Mr. Motta, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for the introduction, bon dia. And it's a pleasure to be here. And even though I'm not a consumer protection expert, I hope I can contribute to this debate. There is a very interesting and important debate, as a matter of fact. So to keep the time, I would say that it's very important for us, especially here in Brazil, the way we look at consumer protection. Consumer protection is about rights, the rights of people who are consuming to have their rights respected as citizens. So for us, consumers are citizens. and they have rights, and these rights should be respected, because the act of consumption is not only important for the economy, but it's fundamental for the livelihood of the people who are consuming. And it's very important to highlight that most consumers, especially in the global south, are poor. The poorest are, the largest number of consumers. So any industry that doesn't take that into consideration and doesn't act, in good faith to respect consumer rights, they are jeopardizing the poorest parts of the population, because they are, those who have to use their hard-earned, limited resources that have such an important role in their livelihood. Having said that, I think it's clear that there are different patterns and different ways of handling consumer protection in G20 countries when you consider the countries of the global north and the global south. Practices that are, frowned upon or banned in the global north are still occurring in the global south, and that jeopardizes consumer protection and consumer rights in the global south. So I think a very good point to start is to advocating for a framework of consumer protection and consumer rights that is equal, along the G20, throughout the G20. So we don't have those situations, for instance, in Brazil, in a particular case that's very important for issues of sustainability, that is the use of pesticides in agriculture. Pesticides that were banned in the global north are being widely used in the global south, and consumers had very little room to protest against that. But in the use of those pesticides, not only affects consumers directly, but also affects nature, affects the quality of the soil, affects the economy as a whole. And so we're talking about a much larger issue than just, one person buying food that is compromised by the use of pesticides. We're talking about a practice that over time jeopardizes the fertility of the soil and has a practice that has negative impact on nature. And why does that happen? Why is it possible for a country like Brazil to allow for the use of pesticides that are banned in most of the global north countries? And companies only show concern when their products are at risk of being refused in the markets of the global south because of the use of those pesticides. But they don't show the same concern about having those products being sold to people in Brazil. And so that, I think, is a very clear example of how those can affect sustainability, the questions of sustainability among G20 countries. To close the question, I think I would like to say that in Brazil, we have a tradition, not only a strong movement in consumer protection, but we also have a very interesting movement that is consumer awareness about sustainability. And that is talk to consumers about how they consume. Why are they consuming? How much they are consuming? Is that sustainable? Can we sustain those patterns of consumption if we keep them in the same pattern, especially among the middle class and the elite? And then the question becomes that this movement argues instead of consuming more, we should consume better. We should consume more smartly, so that the impact of our consumption patterns on sustainability issues are somewhat controlled. And I think this is also an important avenue to explore within G20 countries. I'm not saying at all that consumers are the only responsible for that. Actually, in fact, companies have a bigger impact on sustainability. But having an awareness among consumers about the way they consume can be an interesting avenue for dialoguing with companies to impact the way companies produce, so that we can all work together in changing our patterns of consumption. That is also one of the reasons why our resources are being depleted in the planet.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting points. If I may, I would like to just highlight three interesting points. First, you drew our attention to to consumer rights as citizens' rights, which I think is extremely important across the world, even in let's say the global north, so to speak, to use your terminology, because of course that provides a political and social dimension which is clearer and not just an economic approach to consumer protection. Also the fact that you made a very interesting link, which we fully share at UNCTAD, between consumer protection and inequality and the reduction of inequality. So it's very important, of course, looking at the whole world and from the UN point of view, that consumer protection as other public policies is able to really contribute to reduce inequality where it is more striking. And we often talk about how inequality exists within countries and between countries. And we know clearly that since the COVID-19 pandemic, economic and social impact, and the following cascading crisis that our Secretary General, Ms. Grynspan, mentioned, those who are poorer, those who have less opportunities, those who live in more remote places, or whose families live with lower incomes, were hit harder than those who were better off. So that is, I think, a very important point also. Then two other interesting issues. So the example that you gave on pesticides, of course, makes us think about the importance of product safety from consumers' point of view, of the importance of standards. And this, of course, is also a concern from UNCTAD's broad mandate on international trade and development, but also is of interest of other UN and other international organizations. I'm thinking of the Food and Agriculture Organization, so FAO, and other regional organizations. And the final issue, what you mentioned about consumer movements to raise awareness to sustainability, very interesting that you mentioned not to consume more, but to consume better. And it is true that developing countries, especially such large countries such as Brazil, India, South Africa, because of your very large young population, in a way, provide, let's say, greater hope that consumers can really be what we believe drivers of change towards sustainability. And on this note, I just wanted to mention to those who are listening that UNCTAD released a report earlier this year on competition, consumer protection, and sustainability after an ad hoc expert meeting that discussed these issues almost a year ago at the end of September 2022. And also that UNCTAD has joined the UN Environment Programme and other partners such as Consumers International and governments such as Germany, for instance, in the One Planet Network, which really aims at improving consumer information towards more sustainable consumption. So thank you for these remarks. And I will move to the second question, which is of more general and more open. So from your point of view and on the basis of your experience, what are current emerging challenges in the context of this troika of presidencies? So India, which will end this year, next year Brazil, followed by South Africa. What are, from your point of view, the issues that are shaping discussions and strategies related to consumer protection on an international scale? Over to you, Mr. Motta.
Thank you. I think it's very important to point out that this is for the very first time, I think, in the history of G20, the presidency have been being placed upon countries in the global south, right? Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. So that is a great opportunity for us to discuss from a global south perspective what issues these countries need to bring up to this global table about consumer protection and consumer rights in their own countries, in other countries in the global south, and in the global north. issues of comparison, of fairness, of equity. You know, what is it possible to achieve in the next year in terms of a framework of consumer protection that protects everyone? And you mentioned very, very important point. There is inequality within countries, even in the global north. So the poor in the global north need protection as well, because their resources are also limited and they depend on them for their livelihood. So in that regard, I think there's an opportunity here for Brazil and India and South Africa to propose issues and demands that can be raised in G20 summit, elevating the issue of consumer protection to that level of citizenship rights, you know, and being able to foster open dialogue with companies, because companies is a key part of this process. Companies need to listen to what governments and people are saying in terms of the products that they're putting out, so that people, so that they can understand what people, you know, what people need, and they can provide the products that people need in a pattern that is sustainable for the planet and inclusive to everyone. Other issue I think is important is that of how can we regulate, and that should not only be part of the process within UNCTAD, but also with trade, you know, with WTO. Consumer protection and citizenship rights should be part of the negotiations and trade agreements. Should be an important part, because it's a possibility of revising proposals from global north countries, revising proposals from companies, and being able to point issues that sometimes they are overlooked in international meetings. So having consumer protection association participating in these meetings and pointing those things out at the UNCTAD and at WTO level can be a very important possibility of raising new issues, bringing issues to attention of governments and companies. I'm mentioning companies because, you know, the presence of companies in this forum are more and more regular every day. And at the end of the day, we do want companies to be there, you know, but they need to listen. They need to listen. They need to be open to adapt. So I would say those two issues are the ones that I would raise in this moment.
Thank you very much. Also very interesting points. Of course, we can only agree that these troika presidencies, and of course the previous one also in Indonesia, was quite unique to allow for let's say a convergence of the choice of priorities. And what of course we have seen, and I think this also refers to something that our friend Fernando Blanco mentioned, we saw naturally a digital economy related approach being highlighted gradually since the 16 UNCTAD got a formal mandate on consumer protection. Before we were working on this, but not in such a structured manner. So I think this really provides an opportunity. Of course, the issues that you mentioned, fairness, so reducing inequality, make absolute sense and are at the core of consumer protection. And they are, of course, enshrined in the revised United Nations guidelines for consumer protection, of which UNCTAD is the guardian. The second point, very important, is this business engagement and the need for open dialogues. I think we could not agree more, because you always have to have traders and services providers at the table to raise their awareness, to encourage them to adhere to high levels of consumer protection. And allow me also to mention that the revised UN guidelines for consumer protection added a chapter on good business practices, exactly trying to appeal to business and their representatives in associations or structures of this kind to the importance of consumer protection. Finally, your point on the trade agreements, of course, UNCTAD with this broad international trade and development mandate interacts with the WTO secretariats in a number of issues, as you will know. And what we have noticed is that regional economic organizations, or let's say what is generally called free trade agreements that are, as we know, multiplying for the past decades, tend to increasingly consider consumer protection issues also at regional level, which we think is a very interesting development, because when some of the members of a regional economic organization are small developing countries or even least developed countries, they can have, let's say, a broader framework to support them. And of course, cooperation being instrumental to improve whatever outcomes we want to achieve. So thank you very much for your suggestions. Also the mention of engaging civil society, of course, like your organization and like I know our friends from IDEC Brazil, and of course, CATS being incredibly active within UNCTAD and the WTO regular work as other organizations. So thank you very much. And on this note, I will move to Thezi. It's a great pleasure to have you again in a session that I am moderating. As you know, Ms. Thezi Mabuza is the acting commissioner of the National Consumer Commission of South Africa. Thezi, I would like to also ask you two questions. The first one is on considering South Africa's extensive experience in addressing consumer protection in the context of economic inequality. How do you think the G20, namely your presidency, of course, when it comes, can facilitate these discussions on best practices for reducing consumers' disparities within member countries and globally? You have the floor.
Thanks, Teresa, and greetings to everyone. Thank you. You know, the issue around economic inequality is actually around the unequal distribution of income and opportunities between different groups of people within a particular country. But in my response, Madam, allow me just to confine myself to the unequal opportunities that result in disparities amongst consumers. As I am in that space, I will reflect from that vantage point. You know, when a policy was conceived in South Africa on consumer protection, the purpose thereof was to bring about fairness in the market with the emphasis to reduce and ameliorate any disadvantages experienced by any consumer. The policy went further to state that the supplier of goods and services must not unfairly exclude any person or a category of persons from accessing any goods or services offered by the supplier, or even grant any person or exclude any particular community, population, or a market segment from supply of any goods or services. As we have also alluded that consumer rights are also what we call human rights. In South Africa, there are also constitutional rights. They are based on our Chapter 2, which is the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. So in South Africa, we even went further to ensure that the provisions of the Constitution find expression within the different regulatory instruments to address disparities and inequality. It is essential that within the G20, the discussions should be facilitated to share best practices, as we are aware that inequality is addressed through interventions that could be focused to assist the most vulnerable. We need to learn from one another to have impactful interventions to level the playing field. Unlike what we are really seeing right now, we see a broadening gap between the have and the have-nots. Consumers that normally would have better access to redress are more likely to be those that are better in terms of their financial resources, they are better educated, and they are living in the more affluent areas of the country. We need to do better than that, I think, as regulators. We need to ensure that the vulnerable or those that are marginalized are brought into the fold. Legislation should be there to ensure that the access to redress is brought closer to the public, actually closer to everybody, with more emphasis to those that are more vulnerable, and to ensure that those with diminished abilities to read or comprehend in the process of concluding a transaction in any other form, they have better protection, and we actually embrace them. And now, as you see that before we were in the brick and mortar, but now we even see more vulnerability, especially now when it comes to your global or your e-commerce as such. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So also very interesting points, of course. Again, we know, and in several jurisdictions, consumer rights are enshrined in the Constitution, of course, so that this places them at the highest level, which is so relevant, but of course needs usually to be translated into legislation, regulation, and as you rightly said, also implementation of rights, because of the needs of those who are more vulnerable. And you know that since the revised guidelines for consumer protection, attention has been increasingly granted to groups of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers. And as I mentioned earlier, our assessments and our surveys from consumer protection agencies across the world show that since the pandemic, of course, the most vulnerable and disadvantaged unfortunately were worse off. And so thank you for drawing attention for these important groups, because I think as the world is going through a very serious cost of living crisis, this also tends to affect harder those who are more vulnerable and more disadvantaged. You also mentioned, of course, the importance of this access to redress to all consumers, but and that was, I think, a very interesting point, because we all know that while dispute resolution and redress are essential also for consumers to have trust, to be active in marketplaces, and furthermore in the online marketplaces where obviously the lack of direct contact with services providers, with international traders, can leave consumers really exposed and really unprotected. On this note, I would move to my second question to you, appealing to your experience at the National Consumer Commission of South Africa. Do you think that the G20 could help facilitate swifter information sharing and joint responses to emerging global consumer challenges, enhancing the collaboration among member countries with, but of course, respecting each of these countries' individual regulatory contexts? For instance, can you see that, let's pick again the digital marketplaces? Do you think that we can expect future presidencies of the G20 to facilitate this collaboration between member states in order to enhance consumer protection in e-commerce? Over to you.
Yes, ma'am. I think really the G20 can help to facilitate that, especially where in now, as you have observed, we've seen a shift in the consumer patterns. We have moved away from the brick and mortar markets to online transaction. And the issue of e-commerce has facilitated economic development and growth based on emerging network technologies. It could also be redefined. Actually, it has redefined convenience, and it has become indispensable habit especially for the younger population that we are seeing, especially in us as developing countries. You know, consumers have discarded issues of brand loyalty. They are looking outside their countries and their borders into the global market, in this case, for better products. Thus, what we are seeing is the increase in cross-border trade. Actually, this has created a conundrum for us, mostly as regulators. Our legislation are static, and they are also jurisdictional. You know, consumers feel that us as regulators, we do not even have the muscle or the skill to protect them against you know, other businesses that are outside our borders. You know, as we have said, that when you're looking at the United Nations guidelines, you know, the advice for regulators within the member states was to ensure that we work towards enhancing consumer protection confidence in the e-commerce by actually continuing to develop transparent and effective consumer protection policies, so that we can actually ensure that that level of protection that we have, especially on e-commerce, is the same as what is afforded in your brick and mortar. That would mean that even a consumer in South Africa should have the same protection, whether they are transacting in South Africa or with a supplier that is outside our borders. But then as regulators, we are also now supposed to develop and employ innovative means to protect the interests of all our consumers, especially those who are subjected to abuse and exploitation. So as regulators, Teresa would say that we need one another. We need to share skills and expertise in order to grow and evolve together in addressing the emerging practices that we can see that are actually confronting us. As regulators, we need mechanisms to share information, where our legislation will permit about investigations that we are conducting or others have conducted against a similar supplier with a possible similar contraventions. So we need actually to leverage on one another's expertise and skills, but we can only do that as regulators if we cooperate, we collaborate, but this is actually there to address any cross-border issues and to protect efficient and effective redress to all our consumers in our own jurisdiction, but globally as well to those that will be transacting into our borders while they are in other jurisdictions. Teresa, I'll thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also very interesting point. It is true that we have been observing a rise in e-commerce, especially since, I would say, 2020, for obvious reasons connected with lockdowns and the confinement periods. And also, of course, that this has allowed consumers all over the world, so even those who live well in maybe smaller, least developed countries, but just with access to a smartphone, being able to buy goods and services. So of course, this has opened a number of very interesting possibilities, as you were mentioning, Thezi. So this allowed increased opportunities, but of course also entails risks for consumers that they need to be mindful of, and challenges also, as you mentioned, for regulators. So I do think that you made a very important point that regulators right now also have to use, in a way, also, let's say, improve and be creative on their own using technology to better communicate and to better protect or raise awareness of some groups of consumers, especially those who are more technological savvy, but are not necessarily using traditional channels. At the same time, I think we all agree that a lot of cross-border enforcement issues remain. And despite the fact that we discuss these issues, of course, within UNCTAD, you will know that we have an informal working group on consumer protection in e-commerce with very active participation from consumer protection agencies from all over the world, but also a lot of relevant stakeholders' contributions. We have the International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network, really focusing also on cross-border issues, and other organizations such as the OECD. But despite the existing bilateral, regional, international cooperation, I think we are still also a little bit not at the best possible stage to ensure that exchange of information. Thank you for mentioning how cooperation and this collaboration is essential. And also allow me to mention also that in any case, we also need to be aware of the need to engage with civil society organizations and business representatives, trying to bring them to the discussion, since often, well, the digital platforms, for instance, are much more knowledgeable about the new technological developments than regulators by definition. And I just wanted to remind all participants that in our July Intergovernmental Group of Experts meeting on consumer protection, we actually held a session on building consumer trust when dealing with digital platforms, highlighting a number of challenges, but also sharing best practices and even actions by consumer protection agencies across the world. So thank you very much, Thezi, also for your contribution. I don't know if we have received any questions so far, not that I have seen, I think, but I'm asking the CUTS colleagues to inform me if I'm missing something. I have not really received myself any questions. So I think I will just ask our speakers again, just to, let's say in 1 minute. So first, Mr. Athayde Motta, then Ms. Thezi Mabuza, can you just leave us with what you would like to be the main takeaway of the session today to all our participants?
Teresa, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course, Pradeep, go ahead.
This is a question to Thezi. Thezi, I was involved with the South African Consumer Protection Act in the design stage as a part of the expert panel many years ago. So I have kind of a sense of emotional connect with how the law has evolved. My question is, in terms of voluntary consumer movement, that seems to be absent in South Africa. Can you throw some light on that? Thezi? Hello? Are you there?
We have.
Yeah,
if I can just maybe ask you to rephrase the question, is it around voluntary consumer protection or?
No, my question was, one is I wanted to share the information that I was involved as the external panel of advisors to the South African DTI in drafting the Consumer Protection Act many years ago. So I have an emotional relationship with this, the consumer movement in South Africa particularly, among other countries. But the question to you was, what is the state situation of the voluntary consumer movement in South Africa? We don't seem to find any action or any activity as such.
Wow, yes. We are looking into that in terms of your voluntary and groups, or what we call advocacy groups right now.
Right.
What we had done is we had seen the challenge in terms of now your the groups that would volunteer, because most of them will come in without any resources. What they will be looking at is government to support them in terms of now being the advocacy groups. And then we realized that we did not have better guidelines on how to accredit them and all that. So we have now recently published those guidelines last year. We are getting other groups, especially we have now embraced universities to use the chapters of the students in consumer protection to start up some movement for consumer protection within that space, wherein they do their community outreach and they do pro bono work to service some of the vulnerable consumers where the universities are. because now universities will have the funds and will have that zeal and the skill to offer opportunities for practice for now to start those advocacy groups. So that is where we are right now. So we're using youth, we're using the university, we have published regulations and guidelines to get them accredited and to assist them in upskilling some of them wherein they will lack the expertise. I don't know if I have responded adequately to the question.
No, you have. India runs an I-Tech program, which is a kind of aid program for many countries, and South Africa has used that also for capacity building and so on. Now, there are various ways you can do funding of consumer organizations, and that is a resource problem, which without burdening your treasury, that is something which we can offer you with better advice, but that could be done on a more bilateral basis, except to say that the lack of a voluntary consumer movement is certainly it's not very propitious. Thank you. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you also to Thezi and to Pradeep. Let me just say that next year's UNCTAD's Intergovernmental Group of Experts meeting on consumer protection will actually include a session to discuss the role and the developments of the consumer movement. So I hope that by then, Thezi, we are also able to gather interesting experiences and namely frameworks or guidance instruments that can inspire you. But so before I close the session, because I don't see any further questions, could I ask Mr. Athayde Motta if he could, in a minute, just close his contribution with a takeaway that you would like the audience to hear and keep for the future. Please, over to you.
Thank you. Instead of a takeaway, I'm going to raise an issue that I forgot to mention that I think is really important, even though it's a little bit anecdotal. But the consumer protection movement has generated a sort of an unintended consequences. That is the customer service industrial complex, so to speak. I'm using that term. And in popular culture, issues of consumer protection are generally blamed on the customer service that is generally shown in advertising and movies in the global south. So people who are, angry at a company, they blame customer service that is shown miles away from the company. Usually, sometimes in India, they're like, so these people are not to be blamed for questions of consumer protection. They are workers, low pay, work long hours, and they are not the ones who should be blamed. And popular culture has turned them into, the guilty ones for questions of consumer protection. So let's erase that idea and, put the blame where it should be blamed, on the company.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. I think that raises always the very good point that we all need to work together to better inform consumers and businesses, because even those designations, I think, as you rightly mentioned, can be quite misleading and unfortunate. Thezi, over to you. What would you like to share with us to close the session, please?
I think the most important thing that I think really should be a take home is around the issue of access and unequal opportunities. I think for me, what I would say is that the issue of the alternative dispute resolution platforms and the issues of mediation to bringing in the consumer and the business together, I think that assists, especially when we are looking on issues, especially in the global south, of issues of disparity, issues of language, issues of literacy, wherein now we shouldn't be bombarding consumers with the formal processes of the courts and all that. Issues of mediation is the way to go. And issues that we should really deal with as regulators is wherein that that first layer of mediation has failed. And then we see that the businesses that we really address are businesses that are really not willing to assist consumers. Because the most important thing is that the person that drives the economy is a consumer. Looking after consumers will drive development or will drive our economic growth, wherein consumers will have the confidence to transact. So us as regulators are really pivotal to ensure that we create platforms for consumer redress, but taking sure or making sure that those opportunities for redress and access is available even for the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also very good points. I think access and equal opportunities in general are always relevant because, of course, access by consumers to goods and essential services is actually also contemplated in the UN guidelines for consumer protection since the revision of 2015. And of course, I think all of us have one way or another been working closely on how to improve and sometimes frame dispute resolution and redress to the benefit of consumers and finally also of the economy. Because if consumers can resolve their problems and have a swift reply to their complaints and even get compensation as quickly as possible, this also enhances their trust in marketplaces, and it can help economies to flourish. So on this note, again, thanking very much my two speakers. I would like to also thank the participants and hand over to Pradeep Mehta for the following session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Teresa. And let me come to the next session. Unfortunately, India has had to leave because of some internet problems and it is getting late and so on. So we have three speakers. To begin with, Saroja Sundaram, the Executive Director of the Citizen, Consumer and Civic Action Group in Chennai, India. She is also a member of the General Council of Consumers International. Saroja, there are two questions to you. You might have read the question which was sent to you.
Yes,
Pradeep. Sorry?
Yeah, Pradeep, yes, I said.
Yeah. One is that India's active engagement in G20 summits and its significant role as the host of this year's summit. What benefits do you perceive in emphasizing the inclusion of consumer protection as a key focal point in the G20 agenda? I mean, this is the question which is a bit late, as was already pointed out by Vijay. It is too late to include that, but at least we are making the noise. So that the noise continues in Brazil and South Africa, and we're able to. I'm glad that Motta from Brazil was there, who's the civil society C20 moderator, C20 moderator in Brazil, and he would have taken a note of what we've spoken about, so that we can continue. And that is the main purpose of this webinar: is that how do you bring it out from the trough and take it forward. Over to you, Saroja.
Yeah, thank you, Pradeep. I think this is a wonderful webinar, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And so I think it is crucial, like as pointed out by the earlier speakers, I think it is important to recognize the importance of consumer protection and empowerment across the G20 agenda. With the rapid changes that are happening and the impact of technology from finance to food, from trade to energy, this must lead to a safe, fair, and sustainable world for consumers. At a time of rapid change, widening fault lines and lessening trust in a system that appears to favor the few, leaders need to talk about these topics and the future in a way that is connected to our everyday lives across sectors and not in silos. The G20 summit should be a permanent and integral, consumer summit should be a permanent and integral part of the G20 agenda. Consumer protection and empowerment has to be built across borders, I think. While India has a robust consumer protection law in place and has been taking several measures to protect consumer protection in the country, emphasizing consumer protection as a key local point on the G20 agenda, particularly when we are hosting the summit, would definitely have yielded several significant benefits for both India and the global community. So I'd like just to highlight a few points here. One is about the collaborative diplomacy. Addressing consumer protection at the G20 level allows for international collaboration in improving it, in setting common standards and best practices. Sharing guidelines can facilitate cooperation among countries, leading to better enforcement of consumer protection regulations globally, especially in today's digital age. Ensuring the protection of consumers with regards to grievance redressal, protection of their personal and financial data is crucial. So, here, when we talk about grievance redressal, to strengthen the ADR and ODR, to have discussions on such sensitive issues in these important forums can go a long way in protecting consumers' interests. So that is one point I thought we should be I think we are missing out on that. And the other thing is when we are the whole world today is reeling under the impact of climate change, and most of the countries in the world, including the members of the G20, are clearly engaging with the SDGs at different levels in different ways. So it will be good actually to and it is also important to incorporate these considerations into the consumer protection policies and to have conversation to understand the global efforts to address these environmental challenges and how each country promotes a greener economy will be helpful to actually adopt best practices on sustainable production and consumption practices, and to see what steps need to be taken by each of the member countries in combating climate change. So yeah, this is another important opportunity. I think like we are probably not utilizing. And it also helps in prioritizing consumer protection, showcases a country's commitment to ethical business practices and responsible governance. This can enhance India's international reputation as a reliable and responsible player in the global market, attracting investment and trade opportunities. So this is also another important point I thought I should mention here. So in conclusion, emphasizing consumer protection as a key focal point on the G20 agenda during India's hosting of the summit could yield numerous benefits ranging from economic growth and international reputation enhancement to social inclusion and sustainability. By fostering cooperation and setting global standards, India can play a pivotal role in shaping a more secure, inclusive, and prosperous global economic landscape. So these are some of the points I thought I should highlight.
Thank you.
Because yeah.
Thank you, Saroja. Let me. You made very important points in terms of what does it entail, the consumer protection agenda, and that has to be reiterated again and again before the government authorities so that they are taken more seriously. Now, my second question is, are there any specific initiatives or strategies you would recommend for integrating robust consumer protection measures into the G20 discussions? For example, let me ask you, there is the Consumers International's World Congress happening in Nairobi in December. And
Yes.
that would be a good platform for you to raise this so that the message goes across that in Brazil, at least, they should try and organize a consumer summit, work with UNCTAD and other consumer bodies, including IDEC and Motta, IBASE, to organize a consumer summit, for example. That could be a good strategy that you could think of. What do you say?
Definitely, Pradeep. To me, actually, I think we need to talk more about sustainable production and consumption, which is part of the SDGs in today's world. I always feel that it is seen in silos. So like we don't connect. For example, SDG 13 and 12 are not seen together. So climate action, climate change, climate action, and sustainable consumption production, they are not seen together. Departments do not work together. The environment department and the consumer protection departments, they work in silos. They don't see the how this sustainable consumption production practices are very important in tackling climate change. So I think it is very important to have these conversations to say that they are all interlinked and for to save the globe, save the world from
Saroja, may I interrupt?
yeah.
Many of these issues have been taken up in the C20 declaration, as Vijay Nambiar pointed out, including both me and Vijay spoke about the fact is that the G20 at least talks about sustainable consumption and production in the life kind of movement.
Yeah,
So
that is true.
So the issues that you're raising, they are fine. They are in, I agree, there is silence, but there is, in fact, a very strong support from the Prime Minister. This whole life mission comes from the Prime Minister, and these are issues which you should and we should, rather take up at the highest level possible. So it is not as if these issues are not there. And I agree, but the government works in silos. There's no doubt about that. We've seen that happening on many occasions, including now the eco-mark itself is lying in I don't know where. We made huge effort. It's just sometimes it is soul destroying. You go knocking at the door of the Babu, and the Babu doesn't have time even to talk to you.
That is true. And so the main point that I wanted to highlight was that it should be actually a holistic approach is required, is what I'm trying to say.
No, my limited question to you is that what kind of strategies, do you think it will be a useful strategy for you to raise it in Nairobi meeting?
Definitely, yes.
Good.
Yes.
I think that is probably the next best step you can do in order to see to it that it is there in the Brazilian summit, wherever it is held. I don't know whether it will be Sao Paulo or Rio or wherever.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, with that, let me segue to Igor Brito from IDEC, Brazil. May I? Saroja, do you have anything more to say? Saroja?
No, I just wanted to say that we are we have missed a very good opportunity, I think, but then this is not the end of anything. So
it's not the end of the world, yeah.
Yes,
right.
Yes. So, yeah.
I know we missed a good opportunity. This is the lack of, there was absence of oversight by Consumers International, and that is where you need to talk about it in Nairobi. Why were they sleeping? At all.
Yeah.
Honestly, I mean, I didn't know about it until somebody, and that is when we decided to, start talking to government. Anyway, it was too late. Shirish was trying to talk to the Secretary Consumer Affairs, but he was doing it alone, with the result that there was no momentum in it at all. Having said that, but anyway, so let's catch up with the loss.
Sure, definitely.
So may I request Igor? Igor, over to you.
Hello, Pradeep. I'm here. Thank you. Hi.
There are two questions that I would like to raise. First is, what role can the consumer and civil society organizations in the Global South play to raise the ante on consumer protection in the forthcoming summit in Brazil? Fortunately, we had a very good participation by your C20 Sherpa, the Brazilian Sherpa. So you have a very good support in any case. Now, how you get consumer protection inserted into that agenda is your challenge, including the summit that I was talking to about with Saroja.
Yeah, sure.
Over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, Pradeep, thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this workshop. I'm very, very happy to be part of this event and including to be with Miss Teresa Moreira and also with Athayde Motta, our colleague from Abong. And well, I need to tell you that this is a great opportunity for us from IDEC, because we really wanted to learn with the experience of all the organization and this workshop. And I want to congratulate you and CUTS International for this strategy to reinforce consumers' strength in the G20 discussions. Well, answer your first question. I think the first impression I would like to share with you and other colleagues that this year we are living in Brazil a great reopening of dialogue between the Brazilian government and the civil society organizations. Because after going through a period of many political conflicts between the civil society organization and the government institution in the last Brazilian administration, we are now living in a period in which civil society organizations have how can I say, a very open space to try to influence public policies and also the official positions. And because of that, I believe that this could also be an opportunity to influence the organization of G20 here in Brazil. And it is clear that the productive sectors and also the suppliers representatives will be continuing to predominate in the spaces for discussions and on international policies, especially here in South America. But I believe that we of the civil society are in a much more favorable moment to focus on the different space of organization of the G20, both in contact with the government and with the engagement groups, such as the Civil 20. Well, I need to say that although IDEC, our organization, the Brazilian Institute of Consumers Defense, is a highly respected civil association of consumers in Brazil, we have more than 35 years of experience in that. We are the only independent consumer representative of the civil society in Brazil with financial and human resources and expertise to influence the government. And I believe that as a consumer movement, we may be isolated here in Brazil on the G20 discussions when we think of the large set of NGOs that will be looking for spaces to claim recommendations for the G20 documents. And well, nevertheless, it is essential to have consumers' voice represented, included, and effectively heard in all the discussions of economic policies as the main affected subjects of them, and as a means to reduce inequality also, as someone said here in the workshop, especially with the Global South context. That's why I say that we consumers organizations around the world need to urgently and efficiently join forces to ensure that our recommendations will be effectively contemplated, in the documents prepared before and during the summit. I think that at least the Brazilian government, as the host of the summit, is sensitive to receiving suggestions and compromise for government officials that contemplate clear and genuine interests of consumers. In the C20, we have the leadership of a consolidated organization in Brazil, ABONG, led by Athayde, and we trust that this leadership will have a great opportunity to also make the consumer's voice represented and heard in all of these discussions to contribute in the development of trusted and inclusive economic policies. And well, these were the first ideas that I wanted to bring to you. Thank you. We are not hearing you, Pradeep. Microphone.
Sorry, I said there is a follow-up question, part of which you already responded, but there's no harm in revising your issues. Well, are there any specific initiatives or strategies you would recommend for integrating robust consumer protection measures into the G20 discussions? I mean, from
Oh,
now
sure.
to the summit, is there any singing and dancing you think will help?
Well, we are trying to be prepared. So we're starting to learn about all that we have to do, but thinking about the desire that we are now seeking to influence the Brazilian government as the host, as the next host of the G20, and considering the tradition of Brazilian diplomacy, to seek to build very egalitarian relations with other countries by trying to converge this culture of diplomacy with regional and national interests. I believe that we need to think about at least three major challenges and opportunity for society beyond the focus of focus on fighting inequalities. And these three challenges are directly related to externalities of social, economic, and technological development that we hope to be included both in the G20 and also in C20 discussions. And they are the food safety, the sustainable consumption, and of course, digital governance and digital rights. If I can explain a little bit more in food safety, because we are once again living with hunger in our region, but now associated with the obesity epidemic. And this is recognized by the Brazilian government. As consumer protection organizations, we need to continue to claim global commitments with the right to information about the risk of ultra-processed and unhealthy foods. And Brazil have a very important role in this kind of field, and also the right to assess the healthy, adequate, and sustainable food, just like the WHO agenda, and also commitment against the excessive use of pesticides and transgenics. We have a huge problem here in Brazil with that, with international impacts also for international consumers. And the other issue is sustainable consumption, as I said. And since it's undeniable that the climate and environment issue must be present in the discussions on the next G20 summit, considering that Brazil will be the host of the summit, the perspective of consumers, which is so important for example, for banning plastic, for the circular economy, for the access to cheap and clean energy, and so many other commitments that need to be assumed by governments, does not appear as much in these discussions. And next year, we have a real chance of making them appear in the final documents of the G20 if we work together and correctly. And the last one, the digital governance and digital rights. Brazil already declared that it will focus on some aspects of that. The universal and manifold connectivity, the artificial intelligence, the digital government and information integrity, and fighting disinformation. In all of these important priorities, both of G20s and FORDEC and consumer movement work, we must ensure that data governance and data protection, companies accountability, and especially an inclusive approach focusing on citizens, users, data subjects, consumer rights, leaving no one behind. So I think a large number of other topics can also be chosen by Consumers Association as key issues to work on during the G20 discussions, such as the over-indebtedness of families, a theme that has been the subject of recent commitments by the Brazilian government, but yet without adequate confrontation. Beyond that, many other themes that can be worked on, and we want to hear all the priorities for the consumer movement, and we really want to work in partnership with you all here in Brazil. And well, you may know more than me that will not be easy task.
No, we will be looking forward to it. And one clue I can give you is that, if you can reach out to Celso Amorim, the strategic advisor to the president.
Yeah, well, we have first of all to face the strong pressure from the productive sectors and influencing most of the discussions just right now. We know that, and we also need to keep in mind that civil society organization from all fields of defense of rights will also be seeking to have the recommendation taken into account, and considering that the openness of local government to listen to society. But well, I'm sorry, Pradeep. I hope that I answered your questions adequately.
Why I mentioned Celso's name is Celso Amorim, as when he was your ambassador to the UN in New York, he actually worked on consumer protection guidelines with us. So he's a good friend, and he's of course a very wise man. And it's good to get his ear.
Yeah, I think we will need here all that experience and all good friends and good partnership to face all the challenges.
But thank you very much. May I request Dr. Subramaniam, Dr. Nava Subramaniam? Are you there? Yeah, please.
Yes, I am, sir.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Subramaniam is the Dean of School of Business in Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham, which is another name for,
University.
An Indian name for university?
University, yes.
Yeah, right. Thanks. Now there are two questions to you which you might have seen. First is, how can the G20 effectively lead efforts to promote sustainable consumption, encourage the adoption of environmental, social, and governance principles, and drive corporate responses that align with SDG goals?
Thank you for that question.
You have about 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay. Thank you for that question. And I want to say that I'm going to answer this question. It's a very big question, very big concepts coming together.
Well, it's your choice.
I'm going to answer.
You could limit your answer.
I'm trained as an accountant. I'm trained as an auditor. And so I'm going to take that perspective in answering this question. And no doubt, to promote sustainable consumption, you need to have the information. For us, from an accounting perspective, the quality of information is very important. Now, talking about information, we have already quite a good, growth, activism, take-up of environmental, social, and governance reporting. And also my research shows that companies are starting to increasingly report on their SDG, how their activities are related to supporting the SDGs. However, I think, how can G20 help from a much larger space is the issue of having the right infrastructure. Today, we are flooded with information, data. We are not sure how reliable, how rigorous that data is. And many countries are also left out because they cannot afford the infrastructure. Fake news, for instance, in my work with the C20 Technology, Security and Transparency Group, one of the key findings from that group was that data integrity, information, fake news is so rife today. It is, a real existentialist crisis section. You don't know what you're reading and if that's true. So that goes to corporate. So we need G20 countries to come together and be really serious of having the right infrastructure, the right agencies, bodies, the assurance providers to ensure that information that we derive from sustainable consumption is believable, right? If you look at the report that's on the UN website, we have still very few countries who are reporting on their sustainable, targets that have on consumption, SDG 12. So what we measure, how do we protect the consumer? And the consumer here in particular, we are looking at is those who are investing in sustainable finance projects. It's really important they be given the right information. And that totally directly relates to circular economy attempts to, sustain, pull back on consumption, recycling, waste projects. Which ones do we really want to invest in? So there's a lot of investment money that's needed. There are investors there, but we need to channel it to the right people and right organizations. So therefore, the G20 really need to come up with policies and infrastructure funding and be asking the questions on inclusion. Civil society have a fantastic power here to make a difference. And so I think I might stop there for that answer for that question. And I know you've got a second question for me. And hopefully I'm on time on the first question.
You have partially answered my second question, but anyway, let me repeat it so that you could be a little more explicit.
Yes.
But particularly in terms of what concrete actions and collaborations can the G20 initiate to ensure a more sustainable future in terms of consumer issues?
Okay, I think
there's a little focus here.
Yes, one of the more okay, let us take the reporting issue now. Okay, the reporting, there are several attempts that have been made by the the International Sustainability Standards Board. There's also the Global Reporting Initiative guidelines. Now, these are very important guidelines that give us information and assure us whether sustainability reports that are coming out have met the criteria. Are they true to form when they report on their sustainability outcomes? And there is a big difference between these two bodies where you have materiality as a real issue. So what do you measure and say we've done well or have not done well? It depends on the assessment of the reporter based on the materiality. So G20 nations could come together and look at and do the research needed, provide the data for good academic research as well. As an academician, I am always short of good quality data. We are always looking for data. So we need from G20 nations a commitment to ensure that the quality of data that companies and any other public agency that is reporting is available. So accessibility to good quality data, the data is assured, and that needs infrastructure, that needs funding for those infrastructure. So that is what I would say that is needed. At the other end, we also need support for the NGOs and civil society organizations, CSOs, to also be empowered to look at and report on when consumer protection laws are broken. When consumers do not get the quality of services or products that have been promised. Earlier on, one of the speakers spoke about packaging, basic packaging and information on what is behind in that I don't know, bowl, can of soup or packet of something. So I think that goes back to my data integrity, that goes back to my message on having the right assurance agencies, right assurance policies that are there to protect the consumer. And I believe that we need to, the NGOs, the CSOs need to be empowered to call for that, because there's always a natural tension and conflicting, at times conflicting goals between corporate, the public sector, as governments, and the civil society. In public interest needs to be served. So accountability is also important. It's just no point having just policies, but the actual accountability. We need better, G20 nations need to harmonize their policies on getting people, I like to say convicted, but at least, identifying the wrongdoers, and making sure that penalties are there and it is harmonized, because our commercial world now is a lot more, as you know, as we've been talking about, the e-commerce is globalized, borderless areas where consumers and the people, providers of products and services meet. So there is a very, very, what do you call, it goes to SDG 17, which is we need to look at how can public-private partnerships be formed to deal with some of these questions. I think India has some it's a really great area, country where some very cutting edge, innovative solutions can be brought upon. They've got already some good business reporting practices in place, but they need more strengthening. So I might end there if my time is.
Thank you very much, Nava. And that was, I think you made some very important points in terms of accountability, which is sadly lacking in many countries, including in India. But we don't give up. We continue to strive. And secondly, I think the point which you made about supporting civil society is again very important. This is what I spoke to our friend from South Africa, that we don't have a strong consumer movement there that needs to be rectified. I mean, it can be done. It's just a question of paying attention to it and some kind of political will. After all, even like Brazil, South Africa is also a very vibrant democracy. In vibrant democracies, I don't see any reason as to why, like India, like civil society movements cannot prosper, cannot flourish, and so on, because we are, as we call ourselves, the fifth estate, and we are quite active in that sense. Within
we are all, I mean, we are all consumers. You are a consumer. I'm a consumer.
Exactly.
And
our
rights. And
everyone is a consumer.
So that's why this topic is of universal concern.
Nava, you are a consumer before you are born and even after you die.
Yes,
did you know that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, the definition is very wide.
Yeah. So, but it is about empowering. When we talk about, the consumer right, and then we talk about sustainability at the same time, it is about, having that awareness. We didn't have much awareness about plastic, right? We were, as consumers, we were doing the wrong thing as well, right? We were just throwing rubbish around, plastic around. And then the more we have, awareness and knowledge, then we say, oh, you carry another different type of bag around for your shopping. And so, but that level of awareness, that level of, incentive for someone to behave differently. There are so many different, levels that you have to attack this problem with. The individual consumer, the corporate consumer, the public sector consumer. Fantastic social procurement policies have been put up by different governments. And we can continue to do that, but we need to do that all together, because this is every country needs to support each other. And so that's why I'd like Thezi, I think Mabuza was, when she mentioned about, that connectivity. G20, I think, is an excellent opportunity for all of us to be realizing the importance of connectivity and how a connected, global community can make a difference. We just defeat, I think, countries and people within countries, NGOs, they get defeated because they feel they're on their own. But when the global voice comes through, and which is where the G20 plays such an important part, they can, with the correct policies, the correct knowledge building, awareness, that protection can come. Because, I want to eat something. I want to sit in a vehicle that is safe. I don't want to drive in a car that is safe. Every one of us wants that. But it was only through strict, good policies based on good knowledge, that you acquire through good research. Building on that, you build on the policies, and then not only just have policies, then you have to have the accountability, and then that ethical, moral, will for people to actually follow. And then if you're still, not doing the right thing, then you just got to get wrapped on the, knuckles, or, put in jail.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nava. With that, we come to a conclusion of this event. And of course, the last session is going to hear Teresa and me again, who will try to summarize. Teresa, over to you. But before you speak, I must share with you one very important fact which has happened as far as India is concerned, which Vijay was pointing out. Our moon lander has landed safely. And so it's a very big day for celebration in India, that we've been able to successfully land a moon rover, or what have you. We call it Chandrayaan in Hindi, Sanskrit. But that reminds me, Nava, the point which you made, and that is something which I need to highlight again, is the motto of G20 is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is what you said in English, that connectivity, that the whole world is one. So I just want to reiterate that. Teresa, over to you.
Thank you, Pradeep. I will be very brief in my closing remarks. I will repeat myself, just starting to thank all the speakers for their fantastic contributions to this important discussion on how the G20 has championed the consumer movement and how it can continue to do so in the future. And I think the following presidencies are very exciting from this particular point of view, of course. UNCTAD as the focal point on consumer protection within the United Nations system has supported all G20 presidencies in advancing consumer protection at the global level since the first consumer summit in Berlin in 2017, followed by Buenos Aires, Tokushima in Japan, and Trieste, Italy. Rising to these challenges is a collective effort involving governments, businesses, civil society, and other stakeholders. And as mentioned earlier, international cooperation is crucial to learn from each other, to establish a common agenda and set standards, norms, and best practices that can foster trust and protect consumers. The G20 Consumer Summits have been an effective way to mainstream consumer protection issues in the wider G20 discussions on such wide challenges such as the digital transformation and the green transitions. The discussions and agreements reached at UNCTAD's Intergovernmental Group of Experts on Consumer Protection Law and Policy have been instrumental in shaping the G20 consumer exchanges, as UNCTAD Secretary General, Ms. Rebeca Grynspan, mentioned earlier today in her opening remarks. The G20 platform is an ally of UNCTAD in advancing consumer protection, and I am particularly delighted that UNCTAD continues to lead multi-stakeholder dialogues and collaborations to address global challenges facing consumer today, since we have the privilege, as I said earlier, to provide the largest platform in all areas under our broad mandate on international trade and development, which of course encompasses consumer protection. As consumers are faced with such global challenges, the G20 can really contribute to deliver global solutions. And this is why I hope the future G20 presidencies of Brazil and South Africa will take the baton for consumers and decide to convene a high-level G20 consumer summit again. Let me conclude by thanking Mr. Pradeep Mehta, Mr. Amarat Singh, and all the CATS International team for the great organization of this global webinar. I hope you have all enjoyed it as much as I do. Thank you very much. And Pradeep, over to you.
Thank you. There's little that I can add to what you've already stated, and except for the last line mentioned by Rebeca in her speech was that we must organize a consumer summit next year. So we are very hopeful that UNCTAD will be able to help us to see to it that in Brazil we are able to have a consumer summit with UNCTAD's support, and maybe you could, escalate the issue into a global conference rather than just a summit, G20 summit, because like the way Teresa we do for the sake of competition, get that high profile on that. And I would like to particularly thank Ambassador Vijay Nambiar. I think many of you may not know, but he's a very distinguished international civil servant. And I think I was very lucky to have him as our C20 Sherpa or coordinator, and to be here with us throughout the event, which only shows us how his humility, which actually in my interpretation is his greatness, that he's been with us all this time. And I look forward to, Vijay, your support with the government of India, particularly that what has not been done. Let's forget the past, but at least they can look at the future. And India has been one of the best examples of consumer protection in many ways, including funding consumer groups and the consumer redressal law. And now Vijay spoke about one very important point, which I thought I must reflect on that. The increasing dominance of tech giants in the e-commerce space. So what he said is the concentration, which is something which is worrisome. Now, what India has done as a very innovative step, to tell you, is they have launched an open network on digital commerce, which is a democratic platform, which is open to anybody to come, all buyers and sellers to come. It is slowly evolving, and so much so that even the big giants, Walmart and Amazon, have all decided to latch onto it as well, rather than be left out. So there are a lot of things which are happening in India in terms of innovation, which we need to share with the world as something which can help us to counter any kind of anti-consumer situations which may arise. For example, in the e-commerce area, that you have a neutral competitor, a competitor which is not interested in making profits, as against usually the rivals in any sector. So, Teresa, my request to you is, and what I would also like to acknowledge with gratitude, is UNCTAD's support to this event, which I didn't mention in my opening remarks, but to say it at conclusion, that's the help which they provided us by reaching out to so many of you, including Fernando, Blanco, for example. Many of these issues has come out from institutional memory, which we may not be aware of. I mean, one institutional memory which I shared with my colleague from IBASE is that Celso Amorim can be a very good ally for the Brazilian summit. I remember spending 12 days with him in Brazil, in one place where he was, doing a international workshop on consumer guidelines to revise them. This is in 1980s sometime, or 1990s, early 90s. So these are the kind of things which help any movement to progress further. Personal contacts matter quite a lot, as you know, Teresa. So with that, and I see there is a very large audience from all over the world. And friends, there is also this is also being live streamed on YouTube. So there are many more people in the audience other than what you see on the screen in front of you. So things are reaching out. We will be able to reach out with the messages from this event through UNCTAD and through other means to the world at large. So I would also like to personally thank all of you, each one of you individually, for having participated in this particular event. Thanks to thanks to COVID, that we've learned how to do virtual meetings, which are quite done at a very low cost. I mean, hardly cost anything at all. Uh, for us to do that and to be able to collect, it's just a question of timing. For Inda, for example, she said it's getting too late for whatever reason, and her internet was also not functioning from Indonesia. So we had some problems, but otherwise I thought it went very well. And what we will need to do is, Igor, I mean, if you could write an op-ed in Brazil or Portuguese language and to put it out in your newspapers, it would be very helpful. And we'll be happy to publish in South African newspapers also, so that we can keep the momentum alive rather than end at this webinar. And that is something which has been, as Teresa and all my other colleagues from India would say, we are very persistent. On whatever we do, we don't sit back. We haven't done this event as part of an event, but it's a part of a long-term campaign that we think is important. We've been doing it ever since we were founded. And this is, by the way, this is our 40th year of celebrations. In fact, in a way, this is also an anniversary celebration for us. We've already done a few events on anniversary particularly. And Teresa attended the first one in Geneva on 6th April with the Director General of the WTO. And so on, and we've done so many. We just did an event in Accra with the Secretary General of the AFCFTA Secretariat. So there'll be more in the pipeline, and I wish we could have also labeled this as one of our 40th anniversary events. With that, let me thank you all once again, and to wish you all a very good day or good evening, whichever part of the world you are in, and I hope to see you all again. Thank you very much.
Stay
Thank
well.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.